Hello and welcome to this FedSoc Forum webinar call. Today, October 29th, 2025, we're delighted to host a discussion on the future of state AG's consumer lawsuits against Chinese companies. My name is Kayla Kleist, and I'm Deputy Director of Practice Groups here at the Federalist Society. As always, please note that all expressions of opinion are those of the experts on today's call, as the Federalist Society takes no position on particular legal or public policy issues. Now, in the interest of time, we will keep our introductions of our guests today brief, certainly more brief than their distinguished careers would deserve. So I highly recommend that if you're interested, you check out their impressive full bios at fedsoc.org. I'll go ahead and introduce our moderator, and then I'll leave it to him to introduce our panelists. Today, we are fortunate to have with us as our moderator, Mr. Ormel H. Skinner III, who serves as Executive Director for the Alliance for Consumers. His work at AFC builds off his time at the Arizona Attorney General's office under Attorney General Mark Brnovich, where he defended constitutional questions and served as the state's lead counsel at the U.S. Supreme Court. Before joining that office in 2016, Mr. Skinner practiced at Wilmer Hale and Ropes Gray in Boston. And I will leave it there. Too short, as promised. Last note before I get off your screens, if you have any questions throughout the program, please do submit them via the question and answer feature, likely found at the bottom of your Zoom screen, so they'll be accessible when we get to that portion of today's webinar. I'll ask that all questions submitted there, A, pertain to this discussion, and B, end with a question mark. With that, thank you all for joining us today. Mr. Skinner, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Kayla. I'm O.H. Skinner. I will try to keep this short only because these are public officials whose bios are well known to the people of their states, and for many of you, probably. I'm joined by Attorney General Mike Hilgers of Nebraska and Attorney General Steve Cox of Alaska. These are two, I think I can easily say, good friends of mine, and two of the most cerebral members of the current AG coalition in the United States. Both of them have served in top flight law firms. Mike also established one of the leading law firms in the state of Nebraska, if not in the country. So they both are people who've served in high power roles in private sector and in the public sector, and are people who have very little need for introduction. But anyway, I'll just note Mike is the Attorney General. Hilgers is the Attorney General of Nebraska. Before that, he ran the firm of Hilgers Graven, which is probably one of the greatest success stories in people returning to their roots and starting a law firm and serving the conservative community. Attorney General Cox most recently was serving as the general counsel of a private company in Alaska. Before that, worked in the Trump administration and the Associate's office and as a United States attorney in Texas. So both have wide-ranging knowledge and experience, and also have a keen interest in our topic of today. I figured I would do a tiny bit of table setting. I assume that many of the people clicked on the button because they actually knew a little bit about this topic, but I think that it deserves a little bit of explanation. There's been a huge ramp up in the year 2025 in terms of what state AGs are doing with respect to Chinese companies or CCP dominated companies in the United States of America. This is a small set of the things that are happening, but I think it tells a tale of the tape. In May, you had the Wall Street Journal break news that multiple states were investigating the main app stores in America for their failure to police Chinese influenced apps like DeepSeek and TikTok. You also, in June, had the Florida Attorney General, James Othmeyer, send a civil investigative demand to Contech, which has hospital monitors and that are manufactured in China. Then in June, you had a lawsuit by Attorney General Hilgers against Temu. And in September, you had Attorney General Hilgers launch another lawsuit against Lorex, which is a camera company that is something that you may well have in your own home. So we've seen over the course of just a few months a massive swing up in the amount of activity in this space. So we're going to touch on those cases a little bit, but I also want this to be a discussion that really looks to the future and where things are going. And because these are two very cerebral, very accomplished men, I also want them to have a chance to explain a little bit more about their thinking at a 10,000 or 30,000 foot level. That's not case specific, just about how they approach this question of Chinese influence in the American economy and with consumers. And so that's how we'll go, and we'll happily take questions at the end. So Attorney General Hilgers, I'll start with you just because you are the person who's kicked off the two most recent lawsuits in this space. If you want to talk about those lawsuits, if you want to give a little bit more color on them, I think that would be helpful for people. And then we'll talk to Attorney General Cox a little bit about how he is thinking about this and what actions he's taking already, even though he became the Attorney General of Alaska merely at the end of August.
Yeah, absolutely, OH. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today with you. It is always great to be here with my good friend, General Cox from Alaska, who truly is an intellectual force. I mean, your bio and introduction, I think, I don't think does quite the service for his talents and his abilities. And I know I speak for all my colleagues to say how grateful we are to have him representing the great people of Alaska, and he's been an amazing teammate in this fight. So the cases, before I talk about the cases specifically, it's probably worth to do a little bit of table setting of my own as to what it is that we're concerned about and how this fits into the broader fight with China. China, we know that they're our greatest competitor. We know they're a dangerous adversary. We know in general that in general a lot of the issues that we deal with when China happened at the federal level. So President Trump is going to be meeting with President Xi this week. We know tariffs and international competition and the military competition and all the rest. And those generally are not within the purview of a state attorney general. But what is within our purview is consumer protection. And I think here it's really worth emphasizing the way that our globalized economy has operated over the last, say, 30 years, probably ever since China's admission into the World Trade Organization, has really it's a globalized economy that with an enormous amount of consumer products and services. So it's not just actual physical consumer products that are being imported into the United States. And that on the surface may be good, it may not be good, but the problem here is that Chinese-based companies are subject to Chinese law, and in China, the law requires that those companies provide information to the Chinese Communist Party. And there is, as we know, kind of broadly, there's a very significant and intentional effort to surveil Americans or get data on Americans or steal intellectual property. So we know this is all going on. And now, for these particular lawsuits, we're seeing two specific examples among many others that I think do exist, where Chinese companies are taking advantage of the American marketplace and American consumers by accessing their information by not being and in doing so not being honest in the marketplace. So what are they doing? Well, in the Lorex case, as you mentioned, OH, we have surveillance cameras. So those might be baby monitors, they might be home surveillance cameras, security cameras, things that help protect Americans' homes, and also in some cases have access to some of the most private moments of someone's life. I have four little kids. We've had baby monitors in our homes. The things that you say at 2 or 3 in the morning, or in earshot of a baby monitor, are very candid, and they expose really the private inner workings of an American home. And the Lorex is sold in the United States, and it is sold as a product that is safe and really a product where the manufacturer protects the privacy of the users. And so, if you are a busy or harried dad or mom and you're just trying to find the best product for your family, and you're going to look at these disclosures and you're going to say, okay, they're doing their best to protect my privacy. What they're probably not doing is sending all my information to the number one surveillance state in the world, China. But that is in fact what happens because the Lorex brand is really a cover for an underlying manufacturer called Dahua. Dahua is also a Chinese company. They have close ties to the Chinese military complex and have known security flaws and issues that allow for backdoor access to all the information that I just described. And so what you have there is a company that is really, I think, design or a back-end infrastructure and hardware that is built for accessing the private information of Americans and sharing it with China, but then also not being honest with American consumers. We saw that a similar type in the Temu case that you mentioned. So we sued Temu because, and a lot of people use Temu. I would tell you at the outset, I'd be very careful about putting that app on your phone. The Nebraskans, Americans download Temu with the promise that it's going to go through the App Store, that it might access some of your information. So maybe it gets a GPS pull here or there, maybe a little bit of information, but certainly not your entire cell phone. But unfortunately, despite those assurances, once it's installed on your phone, the software can recompile and can access everything on your phone, including your text messages, maybe your financial data, your email. Again, not telling people that's what's happening. And so not only do we have a consumer protection, a disclosure issue, if they want to access Americans' information, they should follow the rules, but they should just be honest. I'm willing to bet that market's pretty small. if we all knew our information was getting sent to the Chinese Communist Party. But that is really the core of our suit in that case. But that's the through line between those two, OH, is that you have consumer products being marketed to Americans on the one hand as being safe, limited access, you will protect your information and your security, but on the other, actually are sort of aggressively exploiting known or creating known loopholes on either your camera itself or on your phone that will access an enormous amount of your own personal information. So that's what those two suits were about.
Reminding me yet again that I'm glad I didn't try to summarize the cases and would instead let the person who's bringing the lawsuits summarize the cases. Attorney General Cox, you've been in office only, a matter of weeks at this point. You and I have talked about that occasionally, that it's easy to forget based on the number of things you've already done. But, Attorney General Hilgers just talked about consumer protection lawsuits that he's already brought, how he thinks about these things. You're sitting in a unique position in Alaska. And I think it's important for the rest of the country to hear your perspective, because while I've heard you talk about some of the things that Attorney General Hilgers has talked about, you have a very unique perspective as a former energy executive and a person who has worked inside the actual economy of Alaska and is now in the government, about how all of this Chinese influence plays out with particular effect in places like Alaska, and some of the thoughts you had about responding to that.
Sure. Thanks. First of all, thanks OH, and thanks to the Federalist Society, and thanks Mike for all the kind words. You've been a great help to me as I get up to speed in this new role, which I've been in for just a little over 8 weeks. And I so appreciate what you're doing on this front for the great state of Nebraska. I hope to join you for Alaska. I'll talk soon about what we'll be doing on the China front up here in Alaska. I actually just hired somebody in my leadership team, with a lot of China experience from the Department of Defense and from a U.S. Air Force backdrop. And he'll be leading our China initiative very soon. But let me first, to OH's point, let me step back for a moment, because what we're dealing with from China, in my view, isn't really just a consumer protection issue. It's really a whole of society challenge. China is not merely an economic rival. It's what our own Defense Department calls a pacing threat, the competitor that's moving the fastest to displace the United States militarily, economically, and technologically. And from what I understand, the Chinese Communist Party has been pursuing a long-term strategy that it calls the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And by 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the PRC, its stated goal is global preeminence, not just in trade, but in technology, energy, and governance. And they're not trying to pursue this goal through open conflict or open warfare. That's actually not their preference. What they call it is winning without fighting. And as best as I can tell, the CCP basically uses every lever of influence: economics, propaganda, law, technology, to make free nations voluntarily bend to its advantage. The whole idea of winning without fighting is that you get your adversaries to voluntarily change their behavior in a way that helps you. And so that's where what China does with military and civil fusion comes in. In China, I really don't think there's any separation between the private sector and the state. Every company, whether it sells routers, whether it sells nanny cams, and that Attorney General Hilgers was just talking about, whether it sells batteries or solar panels, every company is subject to the party's direction when the party demands it. And that's why any Chinese-made device or system can also be a channel for surveillance or even coercion. And that brings us back to the economic front. From an Alaska perspective, let me just talk a little bit about what they're doing, what I think they're doing in the ESG and investment arena. And I think this is where the CCP has been remarkably effective, at least in my view, in shaping Western behavior, again, winning or winning without fighting. ESG, as many of you know, began as a movement decades ago for really corporate risk management, but it's really evolved in the last decade or two into something closer to economic engineering. And by pushing these what I would call like degrowth policies that restrict Western energy and oil and gas and manufacturing, what it does is it steers capital away from American energy projects, including, especially in Alaska, where we have a lot of oil and gas. It pushes that capital away towards Chinese-dominated green tech supply chains. And so while we have seen in the last several years, and hopefully and thankfully we're seeing a change on this front, we've seen kind of a debanking effort to shut down Arctic energy finance. China has basically been gaining control over solar panels and batteries and rare earth minerals, the very tools of our energy future in this sort of energy transition. And that, again, is winning without fighting in real time. It's subverting markets without invading any kind of borders. And so that's why, from Alaska's perspective, we're going to be launching a new counter-China initiative, which I'm sure I'll describe later, to really confront this threat from a whole of government perspective, criminal, civil, consumer, procurement, infrastructure, you name it.
So one question I have for Attorney General Hilgers is, so you're more, Attorney General Cox is new in the office and he's talking about things he's about to roll out. You've brought two of these major lawsuits. What has the response been from your constituents and allies? Is this in a land where things are steam is very partisan at every level nowadays? This feels like an issue where this does not break down as a strict red-blue divide. This feels like an issue that is like a much broader ideological question. But is that what you've seen in the response from your constituents? I know you're very in touch with the people of your state.
I think that's right, at least in terms when it comes to this is not a partisan issue, and I haven't seen it as a partisan issue. I think over the last 3 to 4 years, I think Republicans and Democrats both have been waking up to, or probably at least since the first Trump administration, have been waking up to the Chinese threat. I think that's only accelerated over the last, maybe even the last year since the election. So I don't think, what's interesting is I've not seen it through a partisan lens or the reaction through a partisan lens. But what I have seen, OH, I think is something different, which just is a little bit of shock that this could be going on, which on the one hand is a natural human reaction. You buy something where the manufacturer is telling you this is safe and it's secure and you won't have your information taken from you. You sort of rely on those representations, and then you should be shocked to find out that they were actually being dishonest or outright lying. On the other hand, I think it speaks to the work that we all have to do, so that all of us are doing our part to really fight back against this whole of government threat from China, because consumers we all need to be wide-eyed and very clear-eyed, whether we're state attorneys general or we're consumers, about the threat that China poses. And there are so many different mechanisms by which they can actually impact or influence the United States, not just militarily. Obviously, that's very prominent, but through these consumer actions or infiltration, or think about the impact on our water supply or propaganda or the like, that what we have to do really is wake people up so that we are more vigilant as to the threat. Because China has one thing that's really powerful right now, which is they can produce things at such a low price that, and especially when there's cost of living issues all around the country, that it can be very attractive to American consumers. And I think what we have to do is really make sure that people are fully awake as to the threat and the costs and the strings associated with those products, because it's not just an individual issue. You may care, you should care, you probably do care whether or not your financial information is being accessed by China, but it is a national security issue because this information is flowing to the #1 surveillance nation state in the world. And so that was the reaction, I think, that was not, I shouldn't say surprising, but the one I think drives a little bit of our action going forward, OH, is this isn't a partisan issue, but how do we do more to educate people?
Yeah, I think it was very telling when you sued Temu. The Wall Street Journal ran a piece that said something like Chinese spyware only $6.99, and I thought it was a really good summation of a very long complaint, and really teed up the idea of what comes with all of these things. Right? There's a lot of questions about competition and infrastructure and jobs, but this is another overarching layer, which is that they're subsidizing products to get them into people's hands. Now, General Cox, something that Attorney General Hilgers just noted that I think is often left out is the two-way street. There's a lot of emphasis on the surveillance aspects of Chinese products and the information gathering aspects, but something that becomes very relevant in the green tech space and in the energy space is the idea that there's a two-way street. General Hilgers are talking about they can push information, they can push things down to your phone, they have access that goes both ways. They're controlling information flow. He talked about water supply. Something that came out that I think is something you've thought about a lot is when you're dependent on China for your energy infrastructure, not only does that mean that they can turn off the products, but it also means that things come with, as my sister-in-law would say, gifts with purchase, right? So there was a disclosure recently that on a bunch of solar arrays that had come from China, there were transmitter modules, and a lot of people in the defense space have emphasized to me that that was not to transmit information back to China. That was to allow them to disable the arrays if necessary. Is that something that you see as core part of your concern on the energy space? Is where our supply chain becomes dependent, but also they then have a lot of access to push or control the energy infrastructure because it's all green and smart tech? Or is that something that is more of a niche issue?
No, I think for me, I probably think about the most concerning thing from my perspective is energy and critical infrastructure. The CCP is really embedding itself in the hardware of our future, and that includes what you just mentioned. Utilities, telecom infrastructure, the Internet of Things. It's you call it our digital bloodstream, so to speak. And the reason all of these things sort of provide access points for China is, and I think Attorney General Hilgers just mentioned this, China has rolled out a series of laws in relating to national security, counterterrorism, and intelligence over the last 10 years. But under China's National Intelligence Law of 2017, all organizations and citizens, they're all obligated to support and cooperate with the state's intelligence work, period. And I think that means that in practice, there is literally no Chinese company that can refuse a party demand for data access. And so, when we talk about Chinese influence or CCP influenced, we really are being very precise about what we're talking about. This is about the CCP, the party's governance and control. And that's why I think, to Attorney General Hilgers' point, this is why transparency and disclosure matter so much. Consumers really deserve to know when a product or an app, and this is a point that I've been making, is that consumers are not just families. Consumers are businesses, large and small. Consumers are the government. The state is a consumer. And so we all have a right to know whether it's a product or a piece of equipment that we're folding into our infrastructure is effectively an extension of a foreign hostile government that specializes in surveillance.
So something that you both have kind of touched on in different respects is the role that states play and how it is different than the role of the federal government, right? You guys are not negotiating trade deals, but can you talk a little bit about how you view, and we'll go with General Hilgers first and then General Cox, how you view your role in tandem with the federal government? Because one thing I want to flag for people is, the FCC is doing a lot in this space, and it seems like these lawsuits are drafting off of the FCC's work and almost turning into a amplification of the implementation of FCC listings and directives. But I'm curious if you guys could talk a little bit about how you think of your role in that space, because I think very few people actually understand what the FCC is doing, and very few people, this is a less understood aspect of this, and I think it would be enlightening for people to hear.
Yeah, certainly OH. So we have amazing federal partners. I mean, the FTC, the FCC, they're run by outstanding professionals. We have really great relationships with them. We work very closely with them. We communicate very well. I'm a big believer in the Constitution. I'm a big believer in states' rights. I also understand there's a role for the federal government. One of the reasons I got into politics in the first place was because I didn't want people playing outside of their constitutionally defined sandbox, and we were having, and still do sometimes, have too much of that. And so we respect their role. We respect the federal government's role. And so we are complementary to them. And I think they would say, by the way, that they respect the roles of the state and the sort of the traditional historic powers that we have as AGs. And so that traditionally is things like, criminal prosecution, data security, consumer cases, as we've been talking about, both Temu, as well as the Lorex case, as well as our TikTok case, which implicates some of the issues we've talked about, are all consumer protection cases. And so where we try to go sort of within the heartland of our authority, so state consumer cases, and we try to share information. The Lorex case, just as a quick for instance, OH, in Lorex, we really leverage the FCC's no-fly zone list. The FCC, the company I mentioned that created the back-end firmware of Lorex, Dawa, I mentioned that at the beginning. That was on the FCC and is on the FCC's no-fly zone in terms of being used for governmental installations or government buildings. And so we were able to use that information that the FCC developed to be able to further our own lawsuit. And so I think when done right, which I think right now it is being done right, you've got two complementary agencies that are using their authority in the ways that the framers of our state constitution or the federal constitution envisioned. And we're really kind of getting 1 + 1 = 3 collaboration, because we're sharing information where we need to. We're not stepping on each other's toes. We're not seeking contradictory relief or the like. And so I think it's really worked very well. At least speaking for Nebraska under my tenure as AG, and speaking for this current administration's leadership.
General Cox, how do you think about it when you're thinking about it? I know that you brought in somebody from the federal government in respect to help you up there.
Sure. I mean, I guess at a high level, I would say that I'm always looking for kind of whole of government approaches. We have a great partner in the Trump administration on a lot of fronts, especially with respect to unleashing Alaska's energy potential. And so, part of the initiative or task force that we'll roll out with respect to China will be partnering with our federal agencies, the alphabet soup on the federal side. And that's on the law enforcement side, but it's also on the regulatory side. But I think state AGs are just uniquely positioned because we have, as Attorney General Hilgers said, we have the tools to act where the federal regulators may move a little bit more slowly. We don't have to file notice and comment to investigate, in other words. And the reason we've got the tools is because for the first time, at least to my mind, consumers are sort of the front line of this geopolitical conflict. And again, when I talk about consumers, I'm talking about families, I'm talking about small and large businesses, and I'm talking about the state, because every consumer's phone, app, home device, every piece of equipment can really serve as that access point for the party.
So I think consumers as the front lines is maybe the best possible analogy for all of this. It's not something that we've seen when it was Russia or any other country, but we've so integrated. So I think that's a great analogy. Now, General Hilgers, and in particular, I have a question for you here, which is you've talked about the idea that people need to know in the information flow. Not binding you to anything in any particular case, but is the goal here to ban products, or is the goal here to force disclosure of information under the kind of faith that if forced to play by the rules, either the products will be, whether it's on pricing, whether it's on disclosures, whether it's on inability to monetize back end information that they shouldn't have, on a lot of levels. If they're just forced to play by the rules, consumers will then be allowed to make an honest choice between products made in China, products made in America, products made in Belgium, wherever else, right? So is it product bans, or is it force everybody to play by the rules, force the information out there, and then trust the public?
Yeah, that's a great question, OH. And really, it's educating the public in two respects. One is the way you just referenced, which is I'm a free market person. I believe in the free market, but I believe in the free market for it to work. People need to be able to get honest and truthful information. And so in this case, we know our lane. I told you earlier, we stay in our lane. I'm not a federal agency that decides what can be banned from being imported into the United States. And so what we're saying is like, look, if you want to do this, putting aside maybe some of the issues with the App Store, Temu, are they breaking some of the contracts there, which kind of poses a separate set of questions. If you want to do this, just be open and honest. If there is a market in the United States for surveillance companies that go to harried moms and dads and say, hey, this is a great product, but just so you know, not the Chinese Communist Party will likely have access to all of your data, including all of your audio. No, even if you turn the audio off, we can still get access. And oh, by the way, probably other people in your neighborhood or hackers online can also probably get access to it and maybe do two-way conversations with your children. These online predators. Please buy our product. I imagine that's a pretty small market. But my goal is just for them to be honest with what it is that they're selling. And so, no, I'm not trying to ban the products generally. It's unclear whether we would have that power. But what I'm just seeking to do is force disclosure. But the other way I'm trying to educate people is really, really elevating people's minds, sort of the precarious nature of this global system, our economic system, and how critical it is to be aware of the ways that it could break down. I'm just going to give you two, for instances. We think maybe, conflict with China looks like ICBMs and a military conflict, but just think in the last, 2 weeks, two major issues have happened in the United States. One was China announcing the new export restrictions on rare earths, which is, 90% of the rare earths, which are critical to almost every major advanced technology industry that we have in the United States. They were going to all come from China, and the export restriction, basically the entire world took a deep breath, which showed the economic leverage that China has. And the second issue is the AWS, Amazon Web Services outage that happened last week, which wasn't, I don't think anyone's suggesting came from China, but really shut down a significant portion of the internet. And both those examples, I think, are just meant to show people like, look, we're going about our daily lives on a sort of a very complex infrastructure, but that infrastructure can be chipped away at in ways that will really impact you and your community and the economy if it's not protected. And doing our part, whether it's state AGs and consumers being educated, is a really important way to develop that layer of insurance to ensure that there's not something down the road that really breaks within our economic system in ways that will really cause significant harm.
Yeah. Now, General Cox, I don't know if you want to have anything to that, but I think you made pretty clear earlier that the thing you're worried about is these ESG mandates and other things that are forcing people into Chinese technologies, and that if there was actually information disclosure and a lack of mandates to buy the left-wing products, that you actually think that we would have that would be a better way to do it, right? It's not like I don't know if you disagree with anything that Attorney General Hilgers just said.
No, I'm fully on board with what Attorney General Hilgers just said, and I do think disclosure and transparency solves for a lot of this. I think the country just has a huge blind spot with respect to these kinds of products, this kind of equipment, how integrated it is to our whole, our society. That's why I call it a whole of society problem. And so raising awareness is really important, not just for the consumers at home, but also for state, local, and federal government. I think there's a huge blind spot in terms of what China actually might have access to. In Alaska, we are, I can't see China from my backyard, but we are closer to Asia than we are to Cleveland, and so it's in our sort of backyard, so to speak. And if we ever had any kind of a conflict with China, like take for example, if there was sort of a Taiwan problem, we would be the area for deployment. And if we've got Chinese technology in our grid, in our telecom, in our fiber, and they can just shut it down. I mean, that's a major risk, right? I mean, that's a
Yeah.
doomsday scenario. But again, I think we've got a blind spot there. I think it's about raising awareness. I think it's about disclosure and transparency, and that's where I think the attorneys general can be really helpful.
So one budding aspect of this going forward that I think is relevant to people, and you hear from some of your colleagues, is are U.S. companies assisting you guys and being helpful to what you're doing? I'll start with General Hilgers because he's doing the most on the lawsuit front at the moment. Are they helping? Are they being, when you warn them about something, are they mostly taking down products? Or are they, some people have read the Apple and China story, right? Or are they so tied in with everything else that they're not actually assisting with the protection of American consumers?
No, that's a great question. I'd say yes and no, OH. I think yes, if you look at the micro when we file our lawsuit, after we filed our Lorex suit as an example, we had outreach with some of the companies who are not named as defendants, but were named in the suit for reselling these particular products. And I will say I was pleased with most of the reaction there. People, a lot of those folks do not want to be selling these kinds of products. I think, and when at least exposed, they've either had just taken them down or took them down promptly. So I think that in that sense, yes. On the other side, no, because these whether it's these adjacent companies, whether it's the resellers in the case of the Lorex suit or maybe the app stores in the case of Temu, these products are being sold, and they're being sold with the help of or on the platforms owned by these other companies. And I think the larger concern that I have is, and the question that I have is, are these other companies doing the right due diligence on behalf of American consumers, whether they're businesses or individuals? And I think the answer to that is unfortunately no, or at least not enough. And I think that's where I would challenge the business community, no matter what industry they're in, is really do the diligence to ensure that you're not aiding, abetting, or otherwise supporting the sale of these products and services that are doing so much harm and potential harm to citizens in our country.
So, I'm gathering from that you would welcome any discussions from U.S. retailers that wanted to talk to you about an investigation or a lawsuit that they've heard about, but also that you do have an admonition to them, which is police your markets better, police what's on your website better, police the products that you're selling to consumers better, especially where they are making their own independent claims about them being a top pick or safe or all those other things, right? Because there is that aspect of American commerce now where the retailers are, more and more nudging on certain products or trying to, borderline vouch for products. And so you have an admonition there of police that better because you're not doing enough at the moment.
Absolutely, OH. It is always almost always faster to get resolution from voluntary compliance than through a lawsuit. But really, I think so yes, we'll always be listening, but at the same time, there needs to be a better culture of know the businesses that you're working with. We have know your consumer when it comes to the financial sector. I don't think we have a culture of really knowing your reseller when it comes to knowing the businesses that you're helping to resell in the consumer products context. And I think that's where we can help them with that culture, because if they do go too far and they themselves help break Nebraska law, that's where we would take action and use the tools that we have to help remedy, but then also deter that conduct going forward.
And just to clarify for the rest of the world who doesn't track all the words quite the same, the more information that comes out through a lawsuit and the more that comes out in discovery, the more on notice retailers are, which then makes a lack of their own action into a more troubling thing, right? That is an aspect of this. It's everyone's allowed to claim at the outset, well, I was lied to just like everybody else. But as more information comes out, I'm hearing you say the more the information comes out and there's still a lack of response, the more that starts to make it into something where you are, but you're still promoting, but you're still listing as a top pick despite a wall of information.
That could not be more right, OH. That's exactly right.
Okay. One thing that I want to give both of you guys, you're both very cerebral men. If you could accomplish one thing with respect to Chinese companies and the Chinese interaction with America, stepping away from your current perch, I'm not, imagine that you were the viceroy of whatever jurisdiction you needed to be, what was one thing that you would change, right? Stepping away from the constitutional thing, if you could just snap your fingers and change one thing about this space, what would it be? I'll go with you, General Cox, to put you on the hot seat, since you can
So
almost see China.
yeah, I'm gonna dodge and pivot on that one, because I'm not gonna pretend to be the viceroy and of what I would do. But I will tell you, if I wanted to accomplish one thing as AG, it would be to stand up kind of an all of government counter China initiative that lasts beyond my office, beyond this administration, and something that is integrated, multi-domain, and uniquely Alaskan. Alaska is the front line in many respects, but it's a front line in the Pacific. Our geography demands that kind of broader view of the threat. And unlike the lower 48, almost nothing enters our state by road. Our sea and our airports are the gateways to Alaska, and they're increasingly targets for Chinese gray zone activity. At Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport, this is the busiest cargo airport in the United States. It's fourth in the world, and the sheer volume of data and freight moving through it, it makes it a huge commercial asset for the state, but also a major vulnerability. It's a prime target for cyber operations, contraband transit, where even a minor disruption could have an outsized national effect. So I'm looking to coordinate with airport authorities, with U.S. Customs, with law enforcement, federal and state law enforcement, to identify illicit shipments and to strengthen cyber resilience. On the maritime side, we want to work closely with the U.S. Coast Guard. We're in District 17, which spans 3.8 million square miles from the Aleutian Islands to the Arctic, the largest district in the nation. That's an area that's constantly tested by illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, and drug trafficking and contraband shipping. Illegal fishing costs U.S. consumers millions of dollars. It depletes our stocks. It threatens Alaska's $6 billion fishing industry. And so partnering with the Coast Guard would also be an opportunity to protect both our fisheries and our sovereignty. And then I've got a civil division, I've got a criminal division. They're a little bit siloed, but I'm trying to find ways to kind of bring them together and build bridges so that we can cross-pollinate and cross-discipline. We got a consumer protection unit on the civil side, but on the criminal side, we want to target fentanyl and meth ingredients that trace back to China. We want to go after, on the civil side, the consumer practices that Attorney General Hilgers is talking about. And then we also want to talk about the vulnerabilities in the state's infrastructure and procurement. And we'll be coordinating with federal agencies and other AGs to share intelligence along these lines. But then back to kind of like the original point, when we talked a little bit about ESG, or at least one of the original questions you asked about that, some of the anti-Arctic energy practices and investments and whatnot, efforts that might move Alaskan retirement dollars or other American dollars into Chinese rare earth and energy companies, green tech companies that really can undercut our own producers and create vulnerabilities. So if I were to do one thing as AG, I would say to build sort of a permanent whole of government counter China initiative that operates at that sort of intersection of law enforcement, infrastructure security, and economic defense. Something that we can use to protect our ports, our fisheries, and our Alaskan people from the full spectrum of Chinese gray zone operations.
Well, General Cox, I will tell you that the news reports, which sometimes are misleading, the headlines are saying that the California employee retirement system just reported that they took a 70% loss on a lot of their green tech investments in recent time, which I think is a good good lifting off point for perhaps revisiting that with the governor and the administration, because I know that you guys all work closely together. General Hilgers, I don't know that you have a lot of Coast Guard oversight or cooperation, but if there's one thing that you could change in this entire space, you've talked a little bit about consumers and knowledge and disclosure, but I wanted to free you up and just say, is there anything in particular that you would be really want to accomplish above and beyond anything else? Not one lawsuit win, not one thing, but just if you could change one thing about the interactions in this space, what would it be?
Yeah, I really kind of take a step back from the legal OH, and I would say what we need really is a cultural market shift within for our consumer products and services. I mean, the reason why China is able to have this really powerful weapon to use against Americans is because they've kind of conditioned us over the last 20 or 30 years that there's going to be a flood of cheap products that will come into the United States. And that's pretty appealing. That's a pretty appealing argument for a family who's trying to make ends meet and trying to do what's right by their kids to be able to buy the lowest cost products. And so I think we need industry to do its part, which isn't just reshoring. We talk about that a lot, but I really think it's sort of creating a culture of innovation to be able to match or at least get close to the price points of these consumer products, which, by the way, can be done. There's a great article, I think, in the Wall Street Journal in the last month or two about how Sharpie did that for its pens. There's other ways you can do that. Move all your production to Nebraska. We've got low cost power. We've got water supplies, great labor force, cheap land. That's my plug for our state today. But also, I think there needs to be
good highway infrastructure, General Hilgers. Good highway infrastructure as well. You can reach a lot of parts of America.
That's right. That's right. We don't have a Coast Guard. We do have admirals, by the way. The governor gives out honorary admiralships. So just so you know, OH. But it's also a cultural shift for the consumer. I don't think it's fair to ask Nebraskans when already we have inflation going on and cost of living issues to pay twice as much for its consumer products to help protect the country. But I do think it's fair if we can ask the industry to try to meet us or meet consumers where they are and make products that are lower cost, to ask Americans just to be aware and educate themselves that it's not just a personal issue, but it really is a national security issue. And we need to work together to shift that culture, I think, a little bit more towards kind of the made in America that we had when I was growing up in the 80s.
So two of the questions as we go to the question queue here. One of them is about whether or not your hope is that the deal on TikTok that the president's negotiating by having an actual divestment from China will free us and mean that product is not subject to the CCP's laws. Yeah, I think that seems like what everybody does want from this, right? Which is, everyone just wants to have a removal of the overview of that CCP surveillance law. But I don't know if either of you have strong thoughts on that. But I think the answer to that is probably yes from both of you, of like, if we can sever the ties to, that CCP law, that's the goal. And none of us are corporate experts at that level, but I think that seems like the goal, right?
I would say yes, but OH, yes, that is one of the goals. Certainly, we haven't talked about the TikTok suit. Certainly, the information flowing back to China operates in a similar way that we've talked about with Lorex or we've talked with Temu. And certainly, there is a propaganda war that's being used through the TikTok algorithm to force really cultural poison on American kids in a way that's not in China. So certainly, if you sever that informational link, that matters. But there is also another issue for us in Nebraska, certainly, which relates to consumer protection and deceptive trade practices. We have this entire very powerful system, tech system on the social media platform that is being marketed to parents as this safe place for children to go and operate. And the truth is, it is anything but. Our accounts that we created under Investigator showed that a 10-year-old account for a young girl in Nebraska within minutes, without doing any kind of searches or anything else, would be inundated with videos that really, really harm the fabric of a family, of that individual, of a society. Things showing really extreme pornography, glorifying drug use, suicidal ideation, body dysmorphia, and the rest. that's driving a significant mental health issue in our country. And so I do think yes, it is the tie to China 100%, but it is not just that. I think there is a broader issue with the harm that's being caused and fueling with the mental health issues for young people that has to be addressed as well.
This one I'll throw out to General Cox because he's talked about this at the broader level. But another one of the questions is, the question is there any particular sectors of the economy that we see as particularly vulnerable? I'll actually flip that question around. Are there any sectors of the economy that you think are not vulnerable to some of the issues that you flagged? Everything from pharmaceutical manufacturing to solar energy production to, freight and shipping. Is there anything that is not at least in the zone of concern here?
Gosh, if I'm thinking about fisheries and seafood in Alaska, I guess the answer to that question is like I can't think of an industry that I would say is safe and isolated. I'd have to really think about that. That said, I'm focused on, I'd say, consumer products and sort of that technological consumer products. I'm focused on energy infrastructure. I'm focused on telecom and utility infrastructure, the Internet of Things. That's probably what I'll be focused on the most. Anything that presents that sort of doomsday national security critical infrastructure threat that we want to mitigate. That's going to be my top focus, I think. It's really hard for me to imagine an industry that's so isolated where China couldn't somehow kind of win without fighting.
So, General Cox, I think you made pretty clear that you're in the first inning of the ball game here. Unclear whether it'll go 18 innings or not, but you're in the first inning. General Hilgers, can you talk about, my sense is that, this isn't a one lawsuit, two lawsuit, I put it on a re-election campaign. This is something you actually believe in. I mean, my sense is that you're also in the early innings of a concerted effort to make this a priority, but I want to give you a chance to kind of highlight that because your colleague got to talk about how he's going to work with the Coast Guard, and I want to make sure you get a chance to tell a version of where this is going in your own mind. No, not knowing what's happening in 6 months, the world could change dramatically. There's a lot of things that can change. I'm not asking you to be Nostradamus, but how do you think of this? Is this like a early innings situation where you have a concerted game plan?
First of all, I don't know how they rank moderators in this world, but you've got to rank pretty high, OH, with the very recent and on point cultural reference to the World Series.
I spend some time with the two of you, and so I'm at least very somewhat familiar with what'll make you laugh.
I think it is early innings. The only question is, I don't know if we can say this is even a game that has an end point. I mean, is it 9 innings or 18 innings? We don't know. I mean, I know this is true for General Cox. It's certainly true here in Nebraska. We don't file suits to file suits. We file suits to make a real difference. And that goes equally, if not doubly true for our litigation campaigns. We're just beginning to scratch the surface of, I think, this infiltration in the consumer space. And I would expect that our fights will continue, not just in these individual suits. We're going to litigate those until we achieve victory, but for additional suits that are to come. Because as General Cox has said, there is a whole of government approach. And I think it's a whole of our consumer economy attack. And so we need to be looking at all of these different consumer products, which we are doing. And so I would expect we will continue to go deep into the game, I can't stretch your analogy in a way that will land. So I'll just say we're going to keep fighting as long as I'm Attorney General.
That's great. We're coming up on time. I always like to actually let people get off to their next thing, but I would just advise everybody who thought this was an interesting webinar to come to, look into what the state attorney generals are doing in the country. The two that are on here are two of the absolute intellectual leaders, but you see a lot of activity coming out of Texas, a lot of activity coming out of Florida. You're seeing other states take action in this. These are just two very cerebral members of that community. But I would say that if you care about consumer protection, keep your eye on this space, because if the last 5 months are any indication, you're about to see a massive wave of activity going into the new year and into next year. And maybe it's not a baseball game. Like maybe it's cricket, right? It could go on forever, right? It goes on until one team wins. So I'll give it back to you to wrap us out. And I appreciate everybody who joined. And I encourage everybody to spend some time looking into what these two attorney generals have done, because I think you'll like what you see.
Well, I will echo those thanks. Thanks so much to our panel for joining us today. We really appreciate you carving out this section of what I'm sure is your busy schedules and sharing your expertise and insight. Thanks also to our audience for joining and participating. Welcome listener feedback by email at fedsoc@fedsoc.org. And as always, keep an eye on our website and your emails for announcements about other upcoming virtual events. With that, thank you all for joining us today. We are adjourned.